I want to close the discussion of effectiveness of monetary policy now by looking at the effect of a change in the money supply at different levels of demand. And the way I want to do it is as follows. So let's look at the money market. Here's money. Here's the interest rate. This is the money supply. And I'm going to draw a money demand like this, very steep, a very steep money demand, okay? An inelastic money demand. The equilibrium would be here, I0, okay? Now, let's suppose that we increase the money supply. So we shift it to the right. So this is a shift in the money supply, and the new equilibrium would be here, I1, okay? Now, let's suppose that the money demand is not as inelastic as this money demand I have in this illustration. So let me draw the money supply and then a rather flat money demand, okay? And let's see what happens with interest rates when the money supply increases. So we begin here at the equilibrium 0, and this is I0, which is about the same level as this I0 here. And I'm going to shift the money supply by the same magnitude as this shift I have here in the graph on the left. So it's about that distance. So it's about, so this shift is about the same size as that shift, okay? So this is money supply 1, and the new equilibrium would be here, 1. And that's I1, okay? Now, what I see here immediately is when the money demand, the demand for money is inelastic, relatively inelastic, a change in the money supply leads to a very large increase in, no increase, but a decrease in the interest rate, okay? Look at from I0 to I1, that distance. When the money demand is elastic rather, sorry about that, elastic like I have here, the drop in the interest rate is that much, okay? So what can I see here? The decrease in the interest rate is much larger when the money demand is inelastic, is more vertical than when the money demand is more elastic, a flatter, more horizontal money demand. So, yes, the effectiveness of monetary policy depends on the elasticity of demand, whether the demand for money is inelastic or elastic. Why? Because depending on the elasticity, the drop in interest rates will be either very large or very tiny. Now, if the drop in the interest rate is very large, like I have it here, the likelihood that consumers and firms will respond by increasing their consumption and investment as a result of that very large increase in the decrease in the interest rate is rather high. It's very likely that when consumers and firms see a very large drop on the interest rate, they will borrow more money and they will consume and invest more. If consumers and firms, on the other hand, see a very tiny drop on the interest rate, will they respond as much? Probably not. Probably we will say, well, the drop is nothing. So I may not even respond to that, to that drop on the interest rate. And monetary policy will be not very effective. Not very effective. Okay? It's important to understand this. The response of consumers and firms to a change in the interest rate depends on the magnitude of that change, which in turn depends on the elasticity of demand. When we have a very inelastic money demand, the drop is relatively high. Not high, but large. And consumers and firms are more likely to respond. When the elasticity of demand is very elastic, the drop is very small, and consumers and firms are not very likely to respond. Why is this important to understand? Well, beyond analyzing the reasons, the motives, why the money demand may be elastic or inelastic, I think it's more interesting to see how this shape of the money demand will imply different effects on monetary policy. And I'm going to do it like this. So I'm going to take a money demand that comes like this. Okay. So there is an inelastic portion of the money demand here, and a more elastic portion of the money demand down there. Why is that? Well, when we are already very close to zero in this range, the decreases in the interest rate are very likely to be minimal, very tiny. If I have an interest rate of 0.5%, how big can a decrease in the interest rate be? I don't know, maybe 0.25? That would be this region here in the demand, in the money demand. If I have an interest rate of 10%, by how much can interest rates go down? Well, they can go down by, I don't know, 9%? By 9%, all the way down to 1%? That's a huge decrease. So in this range here, when interest rates are very high, it's more likely that interest rates can drop significantly from 10 to 1 compared to when interest rates are already very low, like 0.5, and they cannot drop by much. Okay. So reasonably, this is a way to draw or illustrate a money demand at different levels of interest rates. So now let's take now the money supply and see what happens when the money supply increases and we are at different portions of this money demand. Okay, so I'm going to add my money supply here. I'm going to increase it by this amount. Okay, so I'm going to go from this interest rate, which I'm going to call I0, to this interest rate I'm going to call I1. Now, so this is the size of the drop, that much. Now I'm going to go to where interest rates are already close to zero. Now I'm going to call this I0 prime. And I'm going to increase my money supply by the same amount. Now I find myself here. And look at the drop on the interest rate, this tiny drop. So when is monetary policy likely to be more effective to convince consumers and producers to borrow more money and to engage in consumption and spending? Clearly, when the money demand is in this region more inelastic, because the drop in the interest rate will be larger.